Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today, we're going to talk about child sexual abuse and who the perpetrators are and who the victims are. Okay, so the motivation for this video is that on my X feed over the past couple of weeks, I'm seeing a lot of people posting that white males are disproportionately responsible for child sexual abuse. And these are typically done with malicious Twitter accounts whose whole purpose is to demonize white people. And so I decided to look into the data on that, and it turns out that that's not true. White males are not disproportionately responsible for child sexual abuse. Okay, so we're going to look at the actual data and determine who is disproportionately responsible for child sexual abuse in America. Okay, so there's a lot of different data sources on child sexual abuse and sexual victimization more generally. And fortunately, the CDC has a nice web page that we can use that tells us the major sources on child sexual victimization. All right, so if we scroll down on this web page, you can see that these are 4 of the major surveys that are conducted to determine sexual victimization and sexual abuse, including child sexual abuse, which is what's relevant to us. So there's the Bureau of Justice, there's the CDC, and then there's the FBI. They all have surveys that they use and sources that they use to determine the rates of child sexual abuse and the demographics associated with that. Okay, so the main one is the National Crime Victimization Survey by the Bureau of Justice. Okay, so this survey, it's basically conducted annually, and the way that it works is the Bureau of Justice reaches out randomly to over 100,000 households in America in a way that represents the demographics of America. Okay, and they ask them various questions about what crimes they've been subjected to over the past year, whether they reported it to the police, the demographics of the perpetrators and the victims and things like that. And so it's a major source of information that people use when assessing the rates of sexual abuse in America. Okay. Like I said, there's these other surveys also and these other sources that are used, but they have typically a smaller sample size. But there's an organization called RAINN, which we'll go to now. We're going to look at the results of this, that basically integrates all of this information from these different sources on sexual abuse. So RAINN, that stands for Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. And like I said, they're an organization that summarizes data regarding sexual abuse and then summarizes the statistics. So we're going to look at what they have on their website about the statistics on child sexual abuse specifically. All right, so we're going to skip down to the section on child sexual abuse, perpetrators. So first of all, this is important for later because 93% of the victims under 18 know their abuser. In other words, 93% of victims of child sexual abuse know who it is that's abusing them. It's not a stranger. It's typically a family member or a family friend. And that has important implications regarding the racial breakdown of who's committing this, because in a lot of studies, they report the victim's race, but not the perpetrator's race. Okay, but if the victims are often family members with the victimizer, the abuser, then you can assume that more often than not, the race of the victim and the race of the abuser is one and the same. Okay, so it's not a perfect assumption, but as we're going to talk about in some of the papers that we look at, when most of the victims are of a particular race, you could assume that most of the perpetrators are of that same race. Again, you have to take that with a grain of salt because it's not a perfect assumption. Okay. So we're going to go down to the demographics. We're not concerned too much about the age of the perpetrators. Again, what we're really interested in is the race of the perpetrators. All right, so it says 57% of perpetrators are white. Okay, well, 58% of America is white. So they're not overrepresented according to this data, which again is an integrated data from all those sources that we just talked about. What's interesting is 27% of perpetrators are black. Well, black people are only 13% of the American population, so they are massively overrepresented. So if we go to, for example, an online calculator, we can do the math for how overrepresented they are. So again, black people are evidently 27% of child sexual abuse perpetrators, but they're only 13% of the population. So the way that you do this calculation is the percent of the crime minus the percent of the population that they are, divided by the percent of the population that they are, times 100. Okay, and so basically this number means that African Americans are 107% overrepresented in child sexual abuse crimes. So that's massive overrepresentation by black Americans committing child sexual abuse. Now, if we do the same thing for white Americans, again, 57% of child sexual abuse cases are white people. Well, white people are 58% of the population. So you do the math, divided by their population percentage, times 100. Okay, white people are actually slightly underrepresented in child sexual abuse, according to the RAINN data, which, again, that comes mostly from the National Crime Victimization Survey, but from some other sources integrated into it as well. Okay, so right here we have black people are massively overrepresented in committing child sexual abuse, and white people are slightly underrepresented. All right, so again, just in case you're curious about where exactly those RAINN statistics come from, they have a web page, which again I'll link below in the description. But they talk about where their sources come from. It's mostly the National Crime Victimization Survey, which we talked about, because that's the most extensive. But they also integrate other sources here. So you can learn more about it here if you want to know the details, but mostly it comes from the Bureau of Justice. Okay, now that might not even tell the whole story, because there's evidence that there might be reporting differences between black people and white people. In other words, white people might be more likely to report crimes than black people. There's some evidence for that. So if that's the case, then that might actually skew the results in favor of black people. In other words, it might make it look like more crime is committed by white people than actually is, if there's a reporting difference. Okay, so if we go to the CATO Institute, they did a study where they looked at attitudes toward police in America and which demographics are likely to not report crimes. So it's a little bit old. It's from 2016. So it's before like the George Floyd protests and things like that, which radically influenced how the public views police, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, but nonetheless, if you look at this study, what they did is they showed that white people tend to have a more favorable view of police than other groups. Specifically, 68% of white Americans at this time had a favorable view of the police, while only 40% of African Americans did. All right. And if you go down to their table here, they show that white Americans are much more likely to report a crime. So it says 78% of white Americans would definitely report a crime to the police. Well, African Americans, because they don't trust the police as much, only 54% of them say they would definitely report a crime. So what this means is that in all the data that we have about these crimes, like the child sexual abuse, it's probably the case that African Americans are actually underreporting child sexual abuse. And again, because 93% of child sexual abuse cases are from people who know their abuser, they're committed by people who know the child, it's probably the case that more African Americans are committing child sexual abuse that are not being reported. So the overrepresentation of black Americans in committing child sexual abuse, it might even be worse than just over 100% overrepresentation. Okay, and the situation might be even worse than that because there's evidence that after the George Floyd riots, black people have an even worse view of police. Okay, and that's talked about more in this paper. Okay, all groups probably have a worse view of police since that time, but the declining view of police is likely causing more underreporting of crime. Okay, so next we're going to look at this study, which attempts to correct for underreporting by looking at the demographics of children who are admitted to the emergency room due to child sexual abuse. Okay, you can't avoid reporting it if you're admitted to the emergency room. And there's some methodological issues with this paper, but it's the best one I could find for the topic. So what they did in this paper is they took the health records of 95 children who were admitted to the emergency room related to child sexual abuse. Okay, so it talks about the demographics. Interestingly, it says most of them were African American. So 87% of them were African American. All right. The biggest flaw with this study is that they don't say which hospital they took these health records from. So we don't know the demographics of the area where this sample was taken from. Okay, they say it was a hospital in the Midwest, in a Midwestern city, but we don't know. But the vast majority of victims in this were African American. They don't look at the racial breakdown of the perpetrators, but like we said before, because most victims know their perpetrator and it's a family member or family friend, probably more often than not, the perpetrator is the same race as the child. So again, take that with a grain of salt. But when we see that overwhelmingly it's African American girls who are victims of child sexual abuse in this study, we could assume that it's probably African Americans who are committing this abuse. So we'll briefly scroll down and look at the specific results on this. So like we said before many times, most of the people committing this know the child and the family. So again, that suggests racial commonality might be common. Just as like sort of an interesting side note, it says, this is from a different study, results of a different study that they're referencing. It says 69% of male offenders had consumed alcohol and a significant number of them had used drugs prior to the sexual abuse. Okay, so this suggests that oftentimes these abusers are not in their right state of mind. And that's just sort of like a side note of another reason you should stay away from psychoactive substances. Another interesting thing that they talk about is how a lot of these offenders who are committing the sexual abuse of children were themselves sexually abused as children. So maybe we'll do a future video on that, but it's very common that abusers of children were themselves abused. So it's a cycle. But really what matters for us is the results and the method. So again, for the method, the biggest weakness of the study is lack of transparency as well as a relatively small sample size. But like we said, they took a sample of 95 children who were treated for alleged sexual abuse in an emergency department. So again, if they're being treated for abuse in an emergency department, they can't like fail to report that. So the idea here is that this might get around the reporting issue. All right, and it just says of an urban Midwestern research and teaching hospital between 2006 and 2010. So we don't know where that is. That's the other biggest weakness of this paper. We don't know if this hospital is located in a city where, for example, like the vast majority of the population is Black. We don't know. That would be valuable information and would help us determine if there's overrepresentation of Black victims here, but we don't know. All right, but we're going to go straight to the results. The main one that matters for us is, again, this one here. So of the 95 people, child victims, only 12 of them were white, 77 of them were African American. So Africans here are massively overrepresented among the victims of child sexual abuse in this study. And again, we could probably assume that most of the perpetrators of that were also African American. Okay, white on Black rape is extremely uncommon. So it would be very unlikely that these child sexual abuse of these African American girls is committed by white people. All right, and so that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about with this. No, white males are not disproportionately responsible for committing child sexual abuse. Actually, there's a lot of evidence that it's African Americans who are overrepresented quite extensively in committing child sexual abuse. So this is just something to keep in mind whenever you're watching debates take place on Twitter or on the internet. So thank you for listening.